Hello, my name is Dr. Nick Bowman. I'm an associate professor of communication studies at West Virginia University, and welcome back to another chapter of COM105. This is for the fall 2015, and we're going to talk a little bit about Web 2.0. So, before we start, as you've learned with many of our chapters in this class, I like to take a moment and make sure that students have properly read the chapter and have a general understanding of some of the concepts. And so, you're going to see 4 questions on screen here. I'd like you to go ahead and answer those on a piece of paper, on a computer somewhere. Perhaps you recognize the answers, and if you don't, then I'm going to encourage you to stop the video now, go back and read the chapter, and make sure you can answer these 4 questions before we go further. Okay, so let's start off talking about what is the internet. So when we say what is the internet, that's actually a surprisingly complicated question because it really, from a technological perspective, it can mean two things. A lowercase I in internet simply means a network of networks. It's just things connected to other things. An internet is not necessarily digital. It's just a series of networks connected together. The capital I internet typically refers to the digital or the computer-based internet we use today, and it's a global interconnection of networks using a TCP/IP protocol. And it's not overly important you understand what these initials stand for, but here on your screen we've illustrated very briefly how a TCP/IP protocol would work. But that's not really overly important in terms for our class for the study of the social science of technology. When we say what is the internet, I might ask you what the internet is to you socially. And one of the things we can think of is, well, the internet is used in many ways. We have relationships, friendships, family, romantic relationships, people we interact with. We go online to interact with those people. It's our friends. It's where a lot of our friends live. It's where a lot of our friends play. It's where a lot of our friends reach out and contact us, and we contact them. And it's also a place where we might think about, Terminator and this notion of the internet is this, vast connection of large data, social information about all the different people online, the 1.2 billion Facebook users, and sort of how we use that information for good or for bad. And all these characterizations, what I'm kind of getting at are sort of the technical sides of the internet are important to understand, and I don't deny that. But sort of like being able to drive a car that's an automatic, when we're thinking about the internet, we often think about how we use it more so than how it works. That would be, driving a car that's a manual transmission or a stick shift. You can probably drive it better if you know the mechanics, but for the purpose of daily discourse, the internet for us, for the study of communication, and for many of the students in this class watching this video or listening to this lecture, the internet is the place that we live. And we think about that place we live, that digital structure of connections with friends and family and lovers and strangers and data from all over the world. We might ask sort of who runs the internet? And this is kind of an interesting story because perhaps for one of the first times in modern human communication, in modern society, no one's really in charge. And then there's a great story told in the book, The Spider and the Starfish, where a man is trying to convince a group of investors to invest in his internet project. And he's telling about the project. He's going to build websites where folks can log onto a computer and they can type in some words. They can find a website, and then that way they can navigate from one page to the other. And the investors, they like the idea. It sounds a lot like Google today, doesn't it? And they thought, hey, that makes a lot of sense. The internet's probably easier to use if it's organized, if it's searchable, if there's some way to get online and see visuals. Some students in the class may have seen the old terminals where your computer connections were actually text-based. It was just a black screen with white letters on it. And that's very different from today where we have, a mouse and a cursor. You can use your hands and touch buttons and open them. Well, the point of the story is that the investors like the idea of this sort of search engine for the internet. And they didn't want to invest, however, because they wanted to know who was in charge of the internet. And they kept asking the programmer that this all sounds fine. We love your product, but who do we talk to? And the programmer is saying, well, what do you mean? And the investors would say, well, who's in charge of the internet? Like, who's responsible for making sure the internet works? And that might seem like kind of a silly question because in truth, in many ways, the internet doesn't have a governing body or a governing system. At least it doesn't have a system in the way that, the government runs the post office, or that Verizon might control and operate your cell phone signals, or that a radio company might own radio stations. That the internet doesn't really have an owner. It runs largely off the collective work and power of the people posting content to the connections and ensuring the connections operate. And he was flabbergasted, and he kept telling the investors, well, there is nobody in charge. It's an open system. It's a system of networks, and that there are some people who might own servers and might connect things here and there, but for the most part, anybody can hop on there and post content and share it. And the investors didn't like the answer. They kept saying, well, we don't want to invest in this product because there's nobody in charge. There's no president of the internet. There's no CEO of the internet. So how do we possibly make investments in a technology when there's no one in charge? And so the guy joked around and he said, you know what? I'm the president of the internet. I'm sorry. I didn't understand your question. He pretended to sort of not understand what they were saying. It was a foreign language debate or something like this. And I always thought it was funny because they wouldn't invest in this man's vision until he told them that he was in charge. And that sounds like a lie. There is no president of the internet. But what is particularly interesting about that story is that in a way there is. Time magazine back in 2006 published their Person of the Year article. And they actually argued that you, as the internet consumer, are the person of the year. You're the most influential person in society. And that's kind of an odd thing to say. And one of the arguments was that if you look at this chart of different networks, what we basically have is a starfish chart where there's not so much one central node in charge, but rather a bunch of different nodes that are connected. And if one node breaks, other nodes take over and reconnect. And he argued that essentially, because we're all nodes in this starfish, and the more people that log on, the more people that can contribute, and the stronger the network is. In a roundabout kind of way, what makes the internet work is us posting Facebook messages, posting YouTube, checking email, having those social relationships online. That if we didn't collectively post things online, there wouldn't be anything to look at. And the metaphor of the starfish refers to the anatomy of a starfish. And a starfish is kind of a cool creature that if you were to sever one of its legs or sever one of its body parts, the fish will operate just fine. It doesn't have a central nervous system. Its nervous system and its organs are kind of distributed throughout its body. And so the comparison is just like a starfish, where there's no such thing as poking a starfish through the brain to try to kill it. In many ways, the internet's kind of the same way. There's no way to poke a hole in the central part of the internet and unplug it. And if you want an example of this, try to track down a rumor online or try to track down a photo. And every time someone takes it down, right, it pops up in lots of places. You had these individual contributions to the World Wide Web. And I always joke around that that's a pretty cool resume builder, right? I mean, how awesome is that you get to be in charge of the internet? And you can put that on your resume. So I'm always joking with students that when you fill out your resume and apply for a job, make sure you tell them that in 2006 you were Time Magazine's Person of the Year. And if you want more information on this, by the way, you can click that I there on your screen, and it will take you on to a discussion of the Time Magazine article. So what is the internet? As we said, it's a decentralized organization. And the leadership is distributed among the users of the device, of the program. And we'll talk about what that means in terms of how we conceptually understand the internet as a thing. And again, the starfish analogy is that there is no central nervous system. There's no central hub in charge. And as a result, it's real easy to shift around quote unquote executive functions. In this case of the internet, who generates content, who is responsible. And you can think back to our first chapter where we talked about one of the differences between mass communication and media communication was sort of who had flow over the communication itself. And the mass system, computer, internet, computer, radio station, television, right? The message comes from one person to you, and you don't really have any control over that. But on the internet, not only can you choose when you get things, where you get things, and how much of those things you get, You can also post your own content. Now, what's even more interesting about a network is that it implies a sort of two-way communication. It implies that when you have two-way communication, when you have sort of a tit for tat or a constant switching of the sender receiver model, you start seeing networks grow very quickly and very large. And in this example here below, we see how if you had only two telephones in the world, the value of that network might be one. There's one connection between two telephones. And notice how when you have five telephones in a network, you can count 25 connections between all these telephones. And you can see what happens when you have 10 telephones in a network and 20 telephones in a network. Now, imagine on Facebook you have 1.2 billion, not telephones, but social media profiles that could potentially connect to everybody. And this is a notion called Metcalfes Law, and it's used to explain the exponential growth of networks. N squared there, where N would be the number of nodes in a network. If you square that number, you get an idea of how many connections there are. But there is a flaw in Metcalfes Law. And I will challenge you to go on our eCampus page and post, what do you think the flaw in Metcalfe's logic is? And I'll give you a hint. There might be 1.2 billion Facebook users, but how many of them are connected to you? Moving forward, we might think of the internet as a social space. It's a space where we gather and we talk and we assist each other and we sometimes yell at each other. And what's particularly interesting about social spaces is they're often engineered in social ways. And so this graphic that I have here on screen, you can follow along to a more detailed story about social spaces, and specifically about traffic circles. I don't know how many of you have driven through a traffic circle before, but oftentimes in the United States, we don't like them. Traffic circles are used instead of using stoplights, where you have an intersection or you have a space where lots of roads gather at one place. And rather than putting up stop signs or stop lights, some cities in the United States are putting up circles, and they're just concrete or grass circles in the middle of the intersection. And of course, the circles force you to drive around the circle at a slow rate of speed until you can get to the road that you want to turn down. Now, in the United States, we don't like these. Oftentimes, traffic circles are confusing. They have really strange signs with lots of different circles and X's and stripes and merging patterns. Sometimes the circles have 2 or 3 lanes, and they just don't make any sense. Well, and for those of you who live in Morgantown, you know exactly what I'm talking about when you try to drive through the mile ground and you get to the traffic circle, and there's just this massive group of signs trying to tell you how to drive in a circle, and it's quite confusing. Now, there's something ironic about the Morgantown traffic circle, and that essentially it's not done right, because in a traffic circle, the point is, if you design a space socially, you don't need signs, you don't need directions. And here's the idea. This is a traffic circle taken from a relatively normal intersection that you would find in Europe, particularly maybe in Germany or Amsterdam or the Netherlands or Belgium. And what they do is they design the intersection in such a way where you don't have a choice but to drive in a particular way, particular circles, things like this. So for example, by putting the street lights close to the corner of the road, what you end up seeing in here is that you've got traffic circle areas where they highlight the road intersections themselves. By putting cafe tables next to the road, which seems like a really dangerous idea, what you actually end up seeing is when people see chairs and tables, they automatically slow down. We associate chairs and tables with people. You might see this in some neighborhoods where somebody might put a child's bike or a ball near their curb, and oftentimes what they're doing is they're trying to get folks to slow down. When we see a child's bike, we automatically assume there's kids around. We drive slower. If you put up a sign that says slow children playing or slow diners eating, oftentimes we ignore those signs because unless we explicitly see a diner or a child, we drive right by. They put fountains in the center of the traffic circle. Well, you have to drive around them. Fountains are kind of distracting, and the idea is you would look at them while you drive by, which causes you to slow down. They also put the sidewalk on the same level as the street. This allows the cars and the drivers to see each other at relative eye balance. And You can read more about this by following these links, but the general idea around the traffic circle is you don't need signs because the circle itself tells you what to do. In other words, the social norms of the traffic circle are generative. They generate from the environment. If you're driving at a high rate of speed and you see a circle, you have to slow down. You don't have an option. So you don't need to tell people to slow down as well because they already are slowing down. It's not controlled by signs. And here's the real key around the social space. What tends to make traffic circles safer is that now we're not waiting for permission to drive somewhere or not drive somewhere or signs that tell us what to do, but instead we take cues from our environment. If anybody here's ever been in a car accident, one of the strange things oftentimes people will say is, well, they ran a red light, right? I was driving and that person ran a red light, so it's their fault. Well, from a legal perspective, that makes sense. But if you think about the laws of physics, it doesn't make sense. You as a human know that if a car is coming at you and you don't get out of the way, it's going to hit you. And so waiting for the car not to get out of the way and saying later that, well, it's their fault, they had a sign, it doesn't quite add up in the sense that, it's not as if a red light somehow absolves you from the laws of physics. Finally, traffic circles are very simple. They're done by design with a couple lights, a couple chairs in this case, a giant circle, and we're done. You drive through the traffic circle in Morgantown, and what you end up having is a road sign that looks like a Arby's curly French fry, and then they can be very confusing. And what I'm saying about all this is that oftentimes folks wonder, like, how does the internet work? What are the rules of the internet? And there aren't really very many because they're sort of set up by the environment. If you go onto Facebook, the platform is designed in a certain way to get you posting in a certain way, or talking in a certain way, or seeing certain posts. And we'll talk more about that because the idea for the programmers is they don't design it as a computer program like Microsoft Word or checking your email. They design it as a social space. It's designed as a place to where we encourage certain types of interaction, and then we don't encourage other types of interaction. And of course, social engineering can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on eCampus about how social media designs as social spaces might encourage or discourage people to talk to each other. All of this builds on the key principle for today's chapter, today's lecture, and it's on this notion of Web 1.0 versus Web 2.0. And now what I've collected here are a bunch of different examples of Web 1 and Web 2 platforms that I recognize that some of these might actually be kind of older and may not even be applicable to students today. Some of these platforms go back to 1995. But the point is, in Web 1.0, we think about reading and retrieving information. You go online to get movie times, you print them off, you turn the computer off. You're not talking to anybody, you're not interacting with anybody, you're just getting information. It's kind of like going to a digital billboard. You might think of the Encyclopedia Britannica online or a personal website, or just going to a newspaper and just reading the headlines. Web 2 is quite different. When we talk about Web 2, we're talking about this notion of creating and collaborating. And the idea behind Web 2.0 is that in a Web 2.0 application, the idea is that the user actually has to post information. And so you might think of things like Wikipedia would be a really good example of Web 2.0, where the readers also write the content. And so Web 1.0 is read and retrieve, and Web 2.0 is create and collaborate. Now, there's a long list of things that are often associated with Web 2.0, and I'm not going to go through all of these, although there are links in your book chapter to further information about the Web 1, Web 2 design. But a couple of the key ones here would be trusting the users as co-developers. And this is the idea that if we're going to say we create and collaborate, and we're going to talk about a social space, well, you as a user of the technology have to be trusted to help develop the technology. The way that you use Facebook or Twitter or any other social media program often changes the way that other people use it and the way it's designed. We also talk about collective intelligence, and I think Wikipedia is perhaps the greatest example of collective intelligence. Contrary to popular opinion, most research shows that the average Wikipedia article is at least as accurate as your average encyclopedia article, And sometimes the Wikipedia articles are actually a bit longer. And so for those who don't know, I've used this phrase a couple of times. Wikipedia is an example of an online encyclopedia that's not really owned by anybody. It's just written by the people who use it. And the idea as the why it's so successful is that it's so open. And so collectively, it's often the case that many people know more information than one person. And we'll talk about the theories behind that later. I'm a professor of communication. I study media psychology. I hold a PhD. I've done lots and lots of research, and I know a great deal about the psychology and communication of the internet. However, if I were to talk to 1,000 students and take all of their collective knowledge, they would probably know a lot about the internet as well, as much as myself, if not more, because they would even have their personal experiences. In fact, that's this notion of using the long tail. One of the cool things about Web 2.0 technology is they allow us to get information and opinions from people we wouldn't otherwise hear from. Think about how difficult it would have been in the old days for a 16-year-old high school student to perhaps write a blog about their favorite baseball team and have anybody read it. Maybe their mom would read it, or maybe their dad would read it, or perhaps some friends would read it, but for the most part, her article probably wouldn't be very successful. Well, today that same baseball fan, she goes to PNC Park in Pittsburgh and goes to Pirates games, gets to know and starts writing these kind of funny stories about a 16-year-old at the ballpark and what does she do when she's there. She could put it on Facebook or put it in a blog. And people could start reading it and sharing it with each other. And as they share it with each other, it gets more and more popular. And then before you know it, this 16-year-old, high school junior who is just a big baseball fan now has a following. And there's lots of stories of these, online sort of reality stars, which we'll talk about throughout the semester. Again, to reiterate, if Web 1.0 is based on the notion of reading and retrieving information, then Web 2.0 is built on a foundation of creating and collaborating around information. And we'll talk about this stuff throughout the semester. And it's important for you to realize that these shifts are really more philosophical than they are technological. And what I mean by that is often what we're dealing with in this situation is the way we think about the internet, not necessarily how the internet is programmed, although certainly certain types of programming lend themselves to Web 1.0 or Web 2.0 technology. Really good example of using the long tail is the story in your chapter of the Stolen Sidekick. And I'm not going to review it too much here in detail because what I'd really like to do is carry this discussion over to eCampus. So I'm going to encourage you to make sure you've read that story. And in fact, the different images here of the girl who stole the sidekick, and I'm going to put stole in quotation marks, and the image of the New York Times photo here, you should be able to use these images and actually go to the particular blogs and articles about this information. But the short version of this story is that a woman was in New York City and she left her phone in a car. And it was this T-Mobile Motorola Sidekick, which at the time was one of the very first smartphones. And she left it in her car in a cab, and that was the end of that. And if anybody's ever been to a major city, you lose your phone in a cab, you're probably not getting it back. Well, something unique happened in this case where a couple days later, the woman got an email and got some information, and it turns out her phone had been used. And a girl had been taking photos with it. And this is actually the girl who was using the cell phone. And she was taking photos with it, and basically she was using it as her own personal cell phone. And because in smartphones, the original owner often has access to the phone, this caused a bit of an uproar because, now I know who you are. I have your face. Well, these two got into a big fight about it, and the girl wouldn't return her phone. In fact, the famous lines from the girl who was in that selfie was, this is my address. Come on, I'll give you the sidekick so I can hit you with it. And not a very nice thing for this girl to say. And in fact, if you click on the little I here, you can actually go to the story again. And long story short, normally that's it. You tell the girl a phone back, she says no. You go to the police, and no one really does anything because it's New York City and phones get lost all the time. And you know what? Maybe you shouldn't have left your phone in a cab. In truth, the girl who had the phone, she didn't steal it. What had happened is she basically bought it in the black market. So what probably happened is the woman left her phone in the cab. The cabbie found it and sold it on the black market to somebody else. Well, by black market, of course, I'm referring to sort of like the underground purchasing market in a lot of major cities where you can buy, goods that, normally you wouldn't buy a phone from somebody in a subway station. You'd buy it from somebody, who works in a cell phone store. So all this happens. They go to the police. The police say, we'll look into it. They don't really do anything. They show the police the girl's like address and phone number, and the police don't really do much about it. Well, the owners of the cell phone write a blog. And in their blog, they tell the story of the stolen sidekick. And they had this quote from Sasha Cristal, 8905. They show how she's kind of a brat and she stole our phone. We're really upset about this and we don't know what to do. They just kind of used this blog to vent about what had happened in their lives. And what ends up happening is this blog becomes so popular. It gets picked up on Dig, which is kind of like a Reddit site in which people will post anonymous or links to the internet, and they can vote on them, and the ones that get voted on end up higher on the page. And well, eventually it ends up in the New York Times. And in fact, the story gets so big, the New York Times does a story on the stolen sidekick. And after the New York Times does the story, the police go and they arrest the girl. So, the folks who ran this blog were able to sort of use the long tail to eventually get the girl arrested for stealing the phone when the old system of doing things didn't work very well. What happened next? Well, that's for you to read. What I'll encourage you to do is, read chapter 2 and read through the story of the stolen sidekick, because I want to hear about whether or not you think it was ethical to use the long tail as a way to retrieve this phone. And I want you to read real carefully into how the blog was written as well as how the story was told. And I'll see you on eCampus for that. We had Web 1 and Web 2, and I should note there's actually a thing called Web 3 or the Predictive Data Web. And the idea behind this one is that not only do people create and collaborate, but sometimes we can even program our computer to create and collaborate for us. And if you want a good example of this, the next time you use a service like Netflix or Amazon, I want you to look real carefully at the movies and ads that they recommend or send to you and think about where that came from. And what essentially happens is as you behave in those programs a certain way, the programs track your behavior. They track your data. And so when you visit in the future, the programs try to predict what you might like based on what you used to like. And of course, the idea is you never actually told anybody that you like or don't like these things. But at the end of the day, they send you the predictions, and they can be surprisingly accurate. At some point in the class, we're going to talk a bit about Target, the Target Corporation, and how they're able to predict a teenage girl's pregnancy before she knew it or her dad knew it, based wholly on the purchases the girl made on her Target credit card. Web 3 is this idea that as we start working together, as the web starts recognizing things for us and as the internet starts making predictions based on our behavior, what we might start noticing is that the more what we call netizens or people living online there are, the more information there is and the better it gets. Usually when we collaborate on things, the users often produce something better than any one person can produce it. And I think Wikipedia is a great example again of this. And again, I want to challenge you to tell me, why do I think that a Wikipedia article can actually be a very good article? Even though conventional wisdom and most of our teachers and friends often tell us that Wikipedia is this terrible source for information, and yet research shows us that it's actually pretty accurate. And so I want you to think about that question. And again, I'd encourage you to perhaps talk about it on eCampus, and we can try to address the question as to why Web 3 and even Web 2 might actually explain why Wikipedia works more often than it doesn't. Again, going back to who runs the internet, I mean, we really do. And what I mean by that is it's our data. So one of the coolest programs you may come across is called Google Flu. Google.org is Google's nonprofit wing, where they try to generate maps and algorithms and data patterns and programs that can use the data we use online. And by using that data online, we can start to track what's happening in a particular part of the world. And one of the coolest projects they've done is tracked the flu. Now, how can Google track the flu? They're not doctors, they're not nurses, they don't have any diagnostics, they don't take blood tests or cotton swabs. In fact, Google never touches you. But you touch Google all the time. When people get the flu, what do? They go to their computer, they type in flu symptoms, flu remedy, sore throat, fever, and they do a search. And what Google has done is they've tracked spikes in how often people use words associated with the flu, and then correlated that with where in the country or in the world that search happens to be coming from. And you see an example over here where they try to explain in a cartoon sort of how Google flu trends work. And like in the cartoon, you see one for lemon tart, which obviously isn't associated with the flu. But the idea behind the algorithm, and of course it's not perfect, but it might actually tip people off. Organizations like the Centers for Disease Control, or perhaps your local doctor, and they might go, wow, people in Morgantown are really searching for flu symptoms online a lot. I wonder if that means that there is a flu break happening in Morgantown. So it's an example of how the reason that you run the internet is because you're the one creating and collaborating it. If it wasn't for all of us searching for flu symptoms, Google Flu wouldn't exist. And it's a pretty remarkable thing to think about. Now, in all of this, and to quote perhaps one of my favorite heroes, Spider-Man, if you're the one in charge, and all of you are in charge, you've got the responsibility. And one of the things we'll really talk about in this class is how can we use the internet responsibly? Because just as we can use Google to track the flu, we might use Google to track down students who are reading Harry Potter, and we can ban the book, right? When you're tracking data, every time you can track something good, it means you can track something bad. Ex-boyfriends can stalk ex-girlfriends, and ex-girlfriends can stalk ex-boyfriends, and stepdads can stalk stepmoms, and people can harass each other. And because we're all creating and collaborating, we can also go in and monkey with things. I can go into Wikipedia and just change everything. I can vandalize websites. I can use curse words and spray paint things basically all over the internet. And there isn't an answer for this. What we do see from research is that the social design of the internet tends to keep it working. Kind of like how your public park often stays pretty clean. It's often not because you get arrested for littering, but folks don't want a dirty park. That if enough of us keep it clean, it stays clean. Because a clean park is a good park, and a good park is something that's very useful. And so we often have to think about what our responsibilities are. And another thing potentially for the eCampus discussion is I want you to tell me sort of what is your number one responsibility when using the internet? Like, what do you think you're most responsible for, or something you have the most amount of control over? I'd be really curious to hear some of those answers. So in conclusion, while technology can be understood in terms of technology, it's probably more useful for us to think about it in terms of its functional role in human communication. The internet is less of a thing, right, a technology. It's more of a space for socializing, humans creating and collaborating on information for each other. And you, as a user, are the internet, and you're chiefly responsible for its utility as a communication tool. Basically, if you don't use it right, you're the reason we can't have nice things. And we'll think a lot about what does it mean to use the internet, quote unquote, right. As always, we also try to encourage our students to go online, and the following questions are not mandatory parts of the class, but we definitely encourage you to hop on social media accounts. You can hop on Twitter using the Medias Tool hashtag, or you can go to our Facebook group and post your answers there. What do social media and traffic circles have in common? I'd love to hear your example of this. If social media is largely based on Web 2.0, do we even still need Web 1.0? Like, why have read and retrieve when we have create and collaborate? And finally, I'd like to know from you, how might Wikipedia be a good example of Web 2.0? And maybe you can show me a link and tell me if you think it was a good thing or a bad thing. So again, my name is Nick Bowman. I'm at West Virginia University, and I thank you for reading Chapter 2, and I'll see you next week.